Hello and welcome to the Expedition One podcast. This is episode 8. Thanks for joining us. Definitely on a roll here. Got 8 down, or at least we're on number 8. So today we are going to chat a little bit about quality, what makes a quality product, perception of quality, what makes a good.
How do you know
How do you know what makes a good quality
when you're
product?
shopping
What is a good
around?
quality product?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lots of stuff here that we can talk
A
about.
lot.
A lot of stuff.
A lot of good
Okay,
stuff.
where do you want to
Yeah.
start?
Let's talk about function versus style. Because that's kind of a key starting point, I think, for a lot of people. Are you after a specific look or specific function? Obviously you want a little of both, but some people
Yeah.
more one than the other.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about that.
So here's what's interesting when we're talking about function and
Mhm.
style. Usually, function comes first and then style follows. Generally, right?
Mhm.
Let me give you an example. I'm going to use this because it's an easy example. The Jeep. Okay. So what became not the brand Jeep, but the original conception of the Jeep was a demand based upon the military needing a demand for a specific lightweight vehicle, right?
Mhm.
Effectively, it's almost like they replaced the horse almost, you know what I mean? Just light infantry personnel carrier is what they became, right? Um, so I I'm not going to give you some history lesson on Jeep because I honestly don't know it. Not even going to pretend. I know that it has to do with, I think it was Bantam started off and they actually drew up the plans and they kind of showed up and said, here's what we got. And I just think the reality of it was is there as far as for them to be able to produce it. This was for the military, right? So
Right.
any way they could jump in the game to contract to produce it was going to make it. And so that's where it kind of had a few different reiterations, and Ford even got into the mix and was making it. Ford got a little weird about it because Ford made sure to like have an F logo like on every little single part they could, just so even though they were all making the same thing,
Mhm.
for the most part, right? I think the grill was one of the main things that would be different from one to another. But anyway, that whole thing was just a production of necessity, right? If you look at what they were, that this was not about generating style. This was about generating a functional
Right.
piece of equipment. But as a result of that, you create this functional piece of equipment, and um, war ends, and then you have it, and then it's like, well, let's see what we can do to have this go somewhere, right? So that's where you had the Willys company. I know they came into play on that one. I think they came into play during World War II, if I remember correctly. And you had a very specific tool and item, and now us looking at it, now you have a brand that is based upon that item, and it's almost required by particularly by brand loyalists, right? It's like they've created this brand and it has to have that pedigree going all the way back to have that specific look and that style and
Yeah.
that feel, or
Mhm.
else it's not a Jeep, right?
Right.
So like you compare like a Jeep to like a Razor, and I'm not saying one's more advanced than the other, but if you took an old Willys Jeep and you compared it to a Razor and you're like, whoa, you would think that's the evolution of what we're creating here, right?
Mm.
If you're really comparing them. But when you're talking about a commercial item, because we want something that speaks to us and says something, that's why you have it. It has to follow this kind of style chain
Right.
now, right?
Right.
If Jeep didn't follow that, they wouldn't be Jeep. But oftentimes, that's to get to my point. Basically, that's oftentimes what you have is something's created, and it's way more about function,
Mhm.
has really little to or nothing to do about style, and has everything to do about function. The brick phone is a perfect example, right? I say brick phone, everyone knows what I'm talking about, right?
Yep.
And now we're talking about, what we have now with smartphones, right?
Mhm.
That's still what's interesting about that is that smartphone, when we're talking about that, that's still function. It's still all driven by function, but there's still a lot of the internal sleekness of it, the sleekness, the outer look, a lot of that still comes into play, as so it's not some big plasticky brick
All right.
like it used to be.
So now I'm relating that to bumpers
Mm-hmm.
and what we do with function and design, or style, I guess I should say. Function's definitely first, but we really hard to make the style look good.
Mm-hmm.
Design engineering comes into that a little bit, so maybe you want to touch on that side of things too.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all want style, right? That's why Jeep is kept those iconic kind of looks, right? They keep that look because um and it moves us physically, and we think about World War II, and we don't necessarily think about it, but there's these reminder images that exist of the ruggedness, right? And this heritage. So um when it comes to building a product, right? So you have to have the function of it built into it to really get what you want out of it, right? So what we're manufacturing here, so if we're talking about like our front bumpers, right? We're talking about a winch bumper. Very specifically, we want to carry winch, right? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? And the dependencies of how that can be done is based upon the vehicle. It's based upon the winch that the vehicles need. It's based upon all these factors, and that stuff all kind of has to be recognized and brought into the equation when you're going to design a product, right? No matter what it is, right? And it gets tricky because you're trying to design for the function. You want look to matter. But the tricky part is, besides designing it for function and look, it's all about how the human element
Mm-hmm.
interfaces with this, right? It's about the human element in association with the product.
Right.
So
you typically don't have a one size fits all design for products. In fact, we don't do any of that except on instances where it's the same. I'm thinking of GMC Canyon and Chevy Colorado rears.
yeah, that's the only time that you can. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It's because they're back in. It's
And a few
literally the
others,
same
but
bumper,
yeah,
right? It's the
right.
same thing, so you can. But for the most part, no. That's the thing about just about everything, and it's getting more like this. If you went back to like the '80s, um, and '80s and '90s and early 2000s, even a lot of what separated, just depending on different models, right? If you had a truck that was a half-ton truck and a 1-ton truck and a three-quarter ton truck, right? Three-quarter ton and 1 ton. There's Up until a point, it used to be they were pretty close to the same thing, right? The big difference is like, okay, they would put a heavier duty spring in the back, and that was your primary difference. Maybe a larger motor and a heavier duty spring, or things like that, right? And those kind of things were the association. Um, Sometimes, like on GM vehicles, it was like the primary difference in the chassis was this one has a body lift and a beefier suspension, and
Right.
that was the bulk of it, right? And a bigger motor, right, for the higher capacity that the truck might have needed. Um, but that's just kind of like on a historical sense. Now it's like you move up from that, and I can't remember if it was Ford or who it was, if it was Chevy, but back in there somewhere, one of the automakers really changed things by making a half-ton truck more comfortable, right? Instead of it just being a utility item, it was comfortable and kind of sleek and nice to
Mm-hmm.
drive. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Ford. I could be wrong, but I know that that was one thing that they did. And they did it completely different. They put IFS in the front. There was no solid axle. I mean, for Chevy did IFS, I think, before that, but even still, it's kind of like no solid axles. They just got rid of them um, altogether on half tons and made it a much more car-like suspension, more SUV styled, and those changes were huge changes. Everyone followed suit, right? Kind of after that, every automaker after that kind of went, okay, this is how we need to build these. And so you look now and you look at the three-quarter ton and 1-ton model type trucks and bigger. Um, Save Chevy and GM, right? You still have a solid axle option. That's what they come with. They're designed to be very heavy duty and utilitarian and that kind of thing. They've done some changes to the suspension, like where they've added coil springs instead of leaves, and it just makes it a little more comfortable and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But they still want to focus in on making that utilitarian and useful for a lot of people that need to use those for work and that sort of thing. On the other hand, though, like the half tons, like Ford's F-150, I think is the most sold truck in the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they sell more of those than anything. And it's just because the utility part of that comes into the everyday average Joe. I mean, utility companies and stuff like that use those and stuff like that. Companies that do work, but it's just more for the common person. That's why they have so many creature comforts and they get so luxurious and lots of different styles and options. I mean, the Raptor is its own, right? The Ram has their half
Mm-hmm.
tons, but then there's so many different types, and then you have the TRX, and then you really have like Nissan and Toyota jumping in this, and that's its own. I think that has more to do with politics because everyone wonders like why doesn't Toyota do a 3/4 ton or 1 ton truck, and it has more to do with like it's not an easy thing. I think it's like the big three automakers, as far as I understand, really worked hard to make our government make it difficult for Toyota to do that kind of thing,
Interesting.
as far as I understand. But I mean, yeah.
Okay. So on the style side,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we want it to look good, but and we're not going to name names here, but some companies take a more of a one size fits all approach
Yeah.
where
No, it's pretty common.
it's a very similar style for each
Yeah.
different front bumper, versus like,
And there's
so it's
different.
something to consider, right? If you want something that's like going to kind of complement the lines of your specific vehicle, or you really just like the look of this kind of brush guard thing or whatever it is.
Yeah. And there's
That's
different
kind of a
layers to
key
that.
difference.
There's different layers to what you're talking about too, because there is like, okay, we're going to make a style that's the same and we're going to fit that style to every bumper and we're just
Right.
going to make everyone this specific style, right? And then there is the kind of the more like, okay, we're going to take this exact bumper and we are just going to make it fit on everything
Everything.
else. And we're going to trim this here and we're going to adjust this here and that's it. And we're going to add material right here and it's just going to fit on everything.
Right.
And that's its own thing entirely. We don't do either of those.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth of it is the way we approach it is we look at each vehicle individually and we develop the style based upon the vehicle specifically, and we also develop the function based upon the vehicle. And there's rules that I've made for myself in designing, and that they're kind of like this is Expedition One rules in designing a product. And sometimes you just can't follow the rules, and that has more to do with the OEM.
Right.
Has more to do with what you've got to work with, and you're just kind of like, okay, I wish I could do this, but
Right.
I
So
really can't.
if our friend Bill Burke were here, he would
Yeah.
he would talk to us a whole ton about winch placement and where the line needs to come out. And Bill, we need to get Bill on the podcast.
We
Hopefully
do.
we can.
It'd be awesome to
He
have
would
him
be
on.
awesome to have on. But the whole point is that in using your winch properly, which by the way, we're going to do a winch specific podcast as well.
Yeah.
Winching 101. That line needs to be coming out at the right angle.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key component of it. Like, the stuff that Bill's pretty fickle on. I mean, his world is winching, right? So he did the Camel Trophy. If you don't know what the Camel Trophy was out there, it was awesome. So that was a cool thing that Land Rover did, and it was sponsored by Camel cigarettes, I believe, and several other companies. Super Winch was the winch provider for it.
Hmm.
It's kind of like a big British get together almost. Most of it was, Super Winch did have a bunch of their winches made in Britain
Hmm.
at one time. I think those all got, lost in the divorce or what happened there. But it wasn't a divorce, by the way. But anyway, so they, yeah, Bill Burke has this pedigree of off-roading, right? The Camel Trophy was point to point kind of racing. Wasn't so much racing, but it was considered like the Olympics of
Mm-hmm.
4x4ing. And I remember when I was a kid, when I was in high school, like I wrote a paper about being in the Camel Trophy,
Mm-hmm.
and then it got dissolved, and I was so angry because I was like ready to put in my application because I wanted to do it. But anyway, but Bill was an OG. He did training. He did several, like he did the Camel Trophy, and then he trained people for it, and then he was support for it. Um, and so it was really rugged off-roading. So he has very specific design requirements when it comes to stuff that he'll put on his vehicle,
Mm-hmm.
because he's like, look, these are the needs that you have to have. This is what you have to be able to do. And he recognizes certain dangers that come into play if you can't do that. And it's some of them, it's, when I say danger, it's, that's a relative term,
Right.
right? Um, but yeah, for example, like one thing that he doesn't like, and that's one reason why we don't really do it on any of our bumpers, except maybe one, is he hates hidden winch stuff,
Right.
right? He hates winches that they're hidden back behind and they're behind everything and you can't see what your spool is doing. And for good reason, because if you're spooling up a winch and it's all winding on one side or
Right.
something like that's happening and you can't see that, it can damage the winch mount, it can damage the winch, and you can have catastrophic failure,
Right.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
being able to see what your cable's doing is a good thing without having to get your head right down next to the cable in the most dangerous spot and
Right.
looking in
Right.
there to see what it's doing,
Yeah.
right? So his whole thing, the ideal setup is you have an open kind of area with vehicles like Jeep. Yeah, well, you can do that with a
Easy.
Jeep. It's
Yeah.
very easy to do. It's much harder to do on trucks and other things like that, particularly because aerodynamics is becoming a big part of what it is now, right? So they're doing more to push the body in certain directions just to get more aerodynamics,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like Tacomas are a great example. Tacomas have slowly, the front end of that Tacoma has slowly just grown further out. And that's not necessarily bad for actually having room to put a winch, but it's bad for the further away that pushes out, the further away the weight of the bumper moves away. And the more weight that is further away from the suspension, the more strain that's on the suspension, right? So there's a balance here in the
Right.
dynamics of how we're building this, and so you don't want to push it out so far. So like the Tacoma specifically is like the one bumper that we have, full bumper that we have, that doesn't have like a little window so you can see what your winch is spooling, and that's because there's just no room,
Yeah.
and we did not want to push the bumper further out on it.
Right.
So
Design constraints do
yeah,
happen.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
That is a reality.
yeah, but in most of the cases and most times that's not an issue. You've got the open winch mount, or you have windows, kind of built in to the bumper, like on the Rams and the Ultras, where you get a lot of vision on your
Yeah,
winch and you can access it
yeah.
pretty
It's
easily.
pretty much standard on every one of our bumpers as far
Yeah.
as our front bumpers. If we're talking about winching, is that there's
Right.
room to actually look in there and you can
And
actually
that line's
see.
coming out straight, not down at an angle,
Yeah, it's
which is the other, you don't
that's another
necessarily want
big
that
thing.
coming down and out.
Yeah, that's another point of scorn, because so a lot of people don't realize this, but when it comes to cable and
Synthetic line.
synthetic line, right?
Hmm.
The weakest point is going to manifest where it is having to bend, right? So in rock climbing, uh, any of y'all rock climb out there, but the most common knot to use in rock climbing now is the figure eight knot. And the reason why they use the figure eight is because the size of it and the turns of the rope are actually larger. Okay. So if I have a rope and I bring it across a very sharp edge, right?
Hmm.
I am creating weak points on the outer edge of that rope. And that's usually where you see failures occur, right? So like that's why you can't use a square knot in climbing. That's why you're not supposed to.
Hmm.
Is because your failure point becomes your knot. And it's not on the rope as it's going across a rock or anything like that. And in rock climbing, that outer sheath, that's the things people don't realize. That fancy looking colored outer sheath is a
Mhm.
protector for the actual rope that's inside the rope,
Mhm.
right? In off-roading with the lines that you're using, the winch lines you're using, that's not the case, right? You're using like an aramide fiber or something like that, and it's going to have a trade name like Dyneema or Spectra or something like that. And there's a lot of different kinds. That rope, the rope is the rope is the rope, right?
Mhm.
There's really only one company I know of that does something where they actually have a cover. There might be two now, but they're pretty expensive. They're nice, high quality ropes. I'm a big fan. So it's actually, who was it? Master Pole is the one that comes to mind because I think he's the first dude that did that. Um, and I used to have one of his ropes, but I sold it, which was probably a mistake because I miss it. But no, they're really nice ropes. So, but there's most of them aren't that way. Most of the synthetic line you're getting, it's just a rope. So it's one thing, not to get off topic here, but something to think about if you're choosing, do I do cables or synthetic? It's where are
Right.
you off-roading? If you're off-roading somewhere where there's a lot of sharp, jagged rocks,
Right.
cable might be your better choice.
Mhm.
But if you're off-roading somewhere where it's a little more forgiving, not a lot of jagged rocks, more smooth stuff,
Right.
even sandstone, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Synthetic's usually a better
Good
choice.
option.
Mud, dirt,
Definitely
just general use.
safer. We talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of safety in the case of a failure when it comes to synthetic line.
Yeah.
It's just not going to have that force
It's
if
not
it
going to have,
snaps.
yeah, it's not nearly as dangerous
Right.
is the truth of it. So,
Okay. So we've talked about the function, in terms of quality when we're looking at function and style, some key points that you can look at there. But let's talk about materials
mm-hmm.
when it comes to quality, because there's options out there when it comes to what kind of material you're using. We talked in our previous podcast about steel coming out of China
Yeah.
and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say,
What was that?
it's a podcast that never aired. That's what you're saying. We talked in a previous podcast.
Oh,
That
well,
podcast will never
it's
air.
gonna air.
No, it won't. Did we? We didn't talk about it on the one we just did.
Sure, we did. Well, supply chain
Did
stuff.
we? I
Yeah,
don't think.
totally. We totally did. Back me up, JB.
I don't think we did. Okay.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah, no. Let's
But
talk about materials.
let's talk about materials and why it matters.
Okay. So
Steel. Let's start with talking about
let's
steel.
talk about just steel. Okay. So stainless steel is expensive, so that's out.
Right. We're not making bumpers out of stainless
No,
steel.
it's expensive.
Don't ask.
And it's heavy too.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of extra molecules in there that make it heavy. So yeah, that's not preferable. Weight does matter. Okay. So when it comes to steel, like there is different qualities of steel, and there's so many factors that come into actually making good steel. All of our steel is from here locally.
Rocky Mountain
Mountain region. Yep.
Mhm.
Rocky Mountain steel. There that's where we prefer to get it is here. Particularly right now, what's interesting is we couldn't get steel from China if we wanted to, because
Which we don't
just
anyway,
can't bring it in. But
yeah, it doesn't make it this far inland.
it does
generally.
not. So there's lots of different qualities of steel that you can tell. The common one that we use is we just call it P&O. It's pickled and oiled. It's just mild steel P&O. Which it's a certified ASTM steel, right? It's a quality material. We know that it's going to do what we need it to do. We know it's going to last and all that kind of stuff. We avoid using steel that has a high level of mill scale content.
Right. Which is what the pickled and oiled really is.
That's
About
the purpose
mill
of the
scale.
P&O.
Yeah.
Is it gets rid of the mill scale. When you're dealing with stuff that has a lot of mill scale, I've seen a lot of bumpers that have been made in the past, where, or you see pictures of guys doing it in their garage or whatever and stuff like that online and whatever. And it's not to take away from what they're doing. It's just one of the realities of it. It's not that the steel isn't quality. It's not that it's not going to hold up. It has more to do with just the finish. That mill scale becomes your bonding point with whatever you're putting on it.
Right.
Right. If you're putting paint on it or powder on it, that becomes your bonding point, and it's not a great bonding point. So it's more ideal not to be bonding to
Mill scale.
mill scale.
Right.
Yeah, it's just more ideal.
Penetration's not.
Penetration. Yeah, I mean it'll still bond to it, but it's effectively the mill scale is exactly that. It's not the steel. It's not the bumper.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just like a layer of junk on the outside that's stuck to it almost, right? It's still iron, but it's just, it's not the actual steel that you want. So
Right.
that's one key thing about it. The truth of it is, when it comes to material, and I'm not trying to say that China is like a bad place, also that you can't get good material or bad material comes out of China. China's actually done a really good job at getting really good at making better materials, right? It's just sometimes it can be a bit of a crapshoot. I've seen some really garbage material come out of China, and other places that we just don't use. We're unwilling to, so we're very strict on what we use. So not all metal that goes into building a bumper is created equal.
Right.
That's definitely true. So
now that's steel. Let's talk about aluminum and what the difference is. And a lot of people ask me, why aren't you guys doing aluminum bumpers?
It's a great question.
And we have done aluminum bumpers, we do some stuff. But
yeah. So we've done, in the past, we were like, hey, let's give it a shot and see what we can do. We've done some Jeep bumpers out of aluminum. We did a very limited run, and
we still do KL bumpers with an aluminum shell.
Yeah. I was thinking more like JKs.
We did, for a minute. We did that.
For a minute we did JKs. What we found is there's a challenging piece that most people don't know about aluminum, but it's very simple. So the simplicity of aluminum is that it's 1/3 the strength and 1/3 the weight. So you have 1/3 the strength of steel and 1/3 the weight of steel.
Right. So the weight savings is awesome.
Weight savings is awesome, but the strength decrease is not, right?
And if the function is for a winch capable, that you're going to be able to use this product in a recovery situation, 1/3 of the strength is not ideal.
It's not going to work.
Yeah.
You can't really do things that way. So in order to get to the level of strength, you actually have to increase materials thicknesses, right? And so then it's like, okay, is your weight savings at that point, is weight savings that much? Before it used to be just steel was so much lower cost too, but aluminum, it was weird for a while there. It was almost like they were neck and neck, almost the same amount. Aluminum is now going up, and it's becoming more expensive. So it's still going to increase your cost. The fabrication time on aluminum is much longer. It can be much more difficult to fabricate. You have to be much more careful as you treat the metal and weld it and get it prepared and stuff like that to weld. And that's why it's like we have that one bumper that we make out of aluminum. But the reason why we do that is just because of the weight, right? I was talking about that before. It's like, so here's your suspension, right? And your suspension is, you've got a giant motor that's sitting over top of your suspension, your front suspension specifically, right? And the back of your suspension is kind of just generally just coming along for the ride, right? Most of the party's up front, right? And so the front suspension is very critical in being able to handle the robust weight of the drivetrain, but then also just whatever normal driving. And it's usually spec'd at that, right? Depending on what car you're talking about, or vehicle, I should say. Okay. But if you're talking about, if you're talking like a KL, well, KL is more based, it has more features and is more closely related to a car, right? Okay. So the KL is more car-like, whereas the
AKA Cherokee Trailhawk.
Yeah, Cherokee Trailhawk. Yeah.
No, don't know what KL is. But
yeah, and like, so whereas if we jump to a full-size truck, well, the suspension on a full-size truck is much more robust, right? And so it's going to be able to carry a higher load. It's also designed more for utility, whereas a KL's designed for snow and bad weather and dirt roads and paved roads and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Its primary design characteristics weren't like a hardcore off-road vehicle, right? That's what the Jeep is, right? So when you're building something for that, you have to recognize, well, okay, so the suspension components that are on that, the drivetrain components and stuff that are on that. That's why when I see people that want to build up Subarus, I roll my eyes because I'm like, okay, not that it wouldn't be cool, but your Subaru Outback is not engineered to do a 3-inch lift and 32-inch tires and
Mm-hmm.
a big old winch bumper and carry all that load. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
that's not what those engineers were thinking. Okay.
Right.
And the bigger you make those tires, the more force that you have on those components. Even Jeep wasn't doing that, right? Back in the day,
So the
like
JL,
you'd
really?
get, yeah, like
Yeah.
back in the day, it's like you get a YJ and it would come with 29-inch tires, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm gonna put 33s on this. Yeah, and your ball joints are shot in like
Yeah.
5,000 miles,
You're
right?
replacing all
Especially
sorts
if
of
you're
stuff.
going off-roading on them, right? You're
Yeah.
you're having to replace tons of stuff. The axles weren't rated for that kind of thing. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? There's just too much force on the components. So now it's like you look at a JL, and it's like we finally graduated to, okay, our axles are both on the front and rear are
Mm-hmm.
beefy enough to run a 37 comfortably
Yeah.
and not have
The
major
fender
damage
flares are
issues.
already
Yeah, everything's cut out,
wider,
you know. You need a
ready.
minor lift and you can
The
fit a
door was
32.
stronger,
Yeah,
could
rear
hold
door.
a
Yeah.
bigger tire
The
from the
JL rear door
get-go.
is magnesium, right? So
Right.
it's lightweight, but it's
Yeah.
actually super robust and strong. It's all cast and stuff. So, yeah, that's kind of the thing. Whereas like you just look at like a KL. No, dude, the KL is not. It's like Jer got that Jer Park, right? He pushed us into making the KL
Yeah.
bumper. He
We
was
got
one of those.
we got
He was one of
seriously
those people.
pressured.
He was the
There's
secondary
like a
person.
gang actually that pressured us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
We got
And he was
accosted
one
at
of them.
Easter Jeep Safari.
Yeah, yeah. He was one of them. And but no, like dude, he took that on. So we did the bumper on his, right? And he did a lift on it and he had I
Mm-hmm.
think 32s. And he
Yeah,
was
he's
like,
doing
"Yeah, I'm
crazy
gonna
stuff in
do."
it.
He
Yeah.
was doing all sorts of stuff, and that's
We
because
got
they're
a
really
golden
capable.
spike.
But then it's like he's got like a transaxle thing that he exploded on Golden Spike or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was after that that he was like, and it was a lot of work to replace it and everything like that. He's just like, I don't know
Got
if
some
I'm
really
gonna do
cool
this.
pictures though.
We did get some cool pictures. It was cool to see a KL do that stuff.
It was cool. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, we specifically when we designed that front bumper, we designed the front of that aluminum out of aluminum, and the internal part, the internal winch mount piece is all steel, right? But the external part, and that's because we looked at the weight difference and we were like, dang, dude, this is gonna weigh like 50 to 60 more pounds sitting out here. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one it's like I recommend everybody do a synthetic line because it's 30 pounds less. You save a lot of weight with that. I mean,
That's a
the
lot of weight.
winch,
Yeah.
you think about a winch with a steel cable is usually around 100 pounds or more, right?
Yeah.
For a 9 to 10,000 pound winch. And then, you're throwing a lightweight bumper for the Jeeps, like our full width bumpers are 80, 90 pounds at least. Our
Mm-hmm.
stubby bumpers are at least 50, 60 pounds. They're more designed for that sort of thing, but the KL just isn't. And it's the real point is the fulcrum, what they would call the fulcrum, or the point of where here's where the tires meet, this is where the suspension is, and then how far in front of the car is the bumper.
Yeah.
It's on a TJ and a JK and a Jeep and all those. It's actually right there with the suspension. It's very close to the front, right? Because the approach angle is really important. When you're looking at a KL, you're having to stick that in front of the factory bumper, right? Because it's all plastic, so you're pushing it further out. You push it further out, you have
Yeah.
more load, more weight, and more strain on the chassis and
Right.
more damage
So
potential.
long story short, we don't do aluminum.
Long story short,
bumpers,
that's part of the
except
reason
on
why
the KL, we do
we don't do it.
aluminum shell with a steel interior
Mhm.
on that.
And it's because they're
And a group
expensive.
iron.
There's this misnomer. It's weird. People think that, oh, well, aluminum, it doesn't rust, right? And
Oh.
that's correct because aluminum doesn't rust, but aluminum corrodes. So
Different color.
different color. Yeah. Instead of red, it's white, right? It still oxidizes, right?
Yeah,
It still has that moment where it runs into oxygen and there's some electron exchange and stuff goes bad.
happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it'll still oxidize. So people think that and they're like, they paint their bumper, their aluminum bumper, and then when they see like white dripping out of it, because of some part, because it started to corrode underneath it.
Mhm.
They're surprised and they're like, "What is this stuff?" And it's like it's called oxidization. That's
Yeah.
what
So
happens. So
you're not escaping that
you are
necessarily with
not
aluminum.
escaping it.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Are we just going off our points here?
Well, yeah, I was wondering,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure, so you might want to address this down the road or in another podcast. But
Sure. Ow. That was my elbow.
when it comes to fit and fitment, and we're talking about OEM versus an aftermarket part,
Mm-hmm. Was that a question?
they're just I think there needs to be some discussion about that, about OEM versus aftermarket. Okay,
OEM
what
versus
to
aftermarket.
expect.
Okay.
Yeah. What to expect, and when it comes to product install and stuff like that, what's realistic when it comes to aftermarket parts and differences between vehicles,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. No, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when it comes to aftermarket parts, when we're talking about OEM versus aftermarket, there's a few things that need to be recognized. Like the first thing is that um, the I think a lot of people perceive that OEM stuff specifically is super super accurate and super precise,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that is because you go in and when you go in and you buy a car, you're not going over it with micrometers to see
Right.
what's off and what's different and
Right.
what's what, right?
Right.
For the most part, like most of the manufacturers do a really good job on trying to make consistent parts, right? But they do have variations from part to part. I've had parts on vehicles. I had a receiver hitch assembly. I actually took a picture of it um, because it was so far off. I had a receiver hitch assembly that I was looking down the line of the mounts for the receiver hitch, and the angle between these two mounts, right? It was 5 to 10 degrees rotated on one side. And I was blown away that the bumper could even mount on that stock one.
Yeah.
Because an aftermarket one, oh, if it was very rigidly designed, like so it was designed for the holes to line up perfectly, it wouldn't have mounted right.
Mm-hmm.
It just wouldn't have. There's certain chassis and certain components that are extremely accurate, right? So like Jeep frames, when from JK to JL, for the most part, they're extremely accurate. Those are, I'm very impressed with those and have been since the JK came out. You've been noticing a lot of consistency, whereas on older Jeeps, you can have a lot of variation. But then the other misnomers, like people think Toyotas are like the most true thing on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
It's not true. So
we've had experience
I,
otherwise.
I'm not dissing on Toyota by any
No.
means, right?
Mm-mm.
But I've had bumpers we made where we were sending bumpers out to people and we're like, okay, fits perfect on our truck, and we do fixturing and we do a lot of stuff to
Mm-hmm.
maintain. Like here's the exact fit every time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we fixture our parts to make sure that we have consistency, but we also make a lot of slotting in our holes and adjustment in our holes, so you can get that right fit. You can really dial it in. Um, but yeah, originally, like I had a Toyota where I'm like, it was the Tacoma front bumper. We did one where our whole slotting was only really set up to have maybe a half-inch grand total variation, and we had a customer having trouble with fitment, right? So we went and got one, brought it in, took it apart, and we took measurements and we took points on the chassis with points on the body. And the two trucks that we had side by side, made in the same factory and not that far apart, being made within 6 months or so. Actually, it might have been a little longer than 6 months, but it might have been like 8 months that they were made. Um, and they were a 3/4 of an inch difference. They're almost
Mm.
1 full inch between this one and this one, where the bumper had to fit on the chassis to work with the body.
Significant.
Significant, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had two Ford Raptors,
Yeah.
model years apart side by side, and the chassis themselves, where the mounting
Right.
holes were 1 inch from one to another.
Right.
So
So, number one, out the gate, vehicles aren't exactly the same.
no,
There's
there's always
variation. I
variation.
know we found for a while that certain FJ Cruisers manufactured in the southern states were
They'd
just
have just
a
different
little bit
parts.
different.
Yeah, they'd have
Yeah.
different parts on them. You're
Yeah.
like, what the heck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where did this come from?
Hmm.
And then you factor in, if it's a vehicle that's been in any sort of fender benders, not even have to be something huge, but little things.
No, it'll tweak the frame.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize that. I mean, if your frame can tweak a little bit and your airbags don't blow, right? And it
Yeah.
depends on the vehicle. There's some vehicles that very sensitive airbag sensors, right? Very
Hmm.
sensitive accelerometers, and they'll blow because you like looked at them wrong. And then there's ones where they'll take a lot more force,
Hmm.
and your frame can be tweaked. I had a dude hit. It was our JK, that blue one.
Hmm.
Our blue JK got hit by a guy accelerating backwards way too fast, and he nailed it.
Oh,
Right?
on the trail.
No, no,
This
this
one
wasn't
on
on
the
the
trail?
trail.
Oh,
This was in a parking lot.
okay.
This was in our parking lot. This old fella, he's got to be passed by now. He was actually pretty cool. He was a cool old guy,
Hmm.
quite an innovator, right? I won't get into his story, but he was a cool guy. He was just late for an appointment. He backed up,
Hmm.
nailed our Jeep.
Hmm.
It actually tweaked the bumper a little bit, and the frame was slightly tweaked because of that impact. Airbags didn't blow, nothing like that happened. I mean, but we did take it to a frame straightener, and we did have the frame twisted back into place so
Hmm.
we could put the bumper back on.
Hmm.
But it doesn't take much.
Right.
It doesn't take much. So so people will buy a used car, and they're just like, hey, there's no what do you call it, like Carfax reports,
Yeah.
there's no accidents
No
reported or
accident
anything like
report.
that. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, okay, well, that's good.
That is
That's how I like buying my used cars. However, that
doesn't.
doesn't guarantee it, because
Right.
somebody can, call their buddy Larry and say,
Right.
hey, will you fix this for me so I
Right.
don't have to, my insurance price doesn't go up.
Yeah.
You have that stuff all the time, right?
Right. So
So
part of the design is, that there's some variation.
there's some
There's some
flexibility.
flexibility.
Yeah.
And flex is actually an important thing that
Just in general.
in general that
Yeah.
we need to talk about. But it's designed to hopefully accommodate for those variations that could be OEM, could be from a fender bender,
It is as best
whatever.
as it can be
Yeah.
within reason, I should say.
Right.
You know,
But in the world of aftermarket, like, will you have to Dremel out a hole a little or do this or that?
it's
Could
possible.
be.
It's
Yeah.
very possible, and it can
Um,
just be the variation, or it can be that it's one of these other factors that we've talked about.
Right. Yeah. So and when it comes to flex and gap, um,
Sure, mind the
there's
gap.
mind the gap.
Mind the gap.
There's a purpose
There is a purpose for
for
the
gap.
gap. So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So if you've got a vehicle that's a unibody frame construction, and there's not very many of them, Subaru is a unibody frame. Your Toyota Camry is a unibody frame. Camry. Basically, cars are
Mhm.
unibody frames. Jeep Cherokees, the old school Jeep Cherokees, going all the way back to like
Really?
when it was the Comanche and stuff, going like to I think 1982, 83.
OG.
Yeah, the OG stuff, all the way back there, unibody, which was the truth is it's pretty innovating. It was a pretty innovative concept. However, not really the best thing for building up and putting huger tires on stuff, right? It's
Mhm.
not really was the forte. Um, the the body on frame chassis structure that you're used to with like a Forerunner, a Tacoma, pretty much most trucks except for like the Ridgeline, which who does that, right? That's
Right.
not really a truck. Nothing personal, Honda, but come on. But yeah, that sort of thing. I'm trying to think what else. Forerunner, FJ Cruiser. I don't know if I said Jeep, but Jeep, right? Almost everything else that we do stuff for, almost everything is body on frame. Okay. The Sprinter is not body on frame,
Mm.
which is interesting.
Mhm.
That's a unibody structure. So pretty beefy, pretty heavy duty unibody structure for what they're doing on it, but it's a unibody structure. Now, when it comes to body flex, or at least that's what I call it, or me and my friends have always called it. I don't know if that's what they call it in the off-road world or what, but what we always call it is frame body flex, right? And that is just the reality that your body and frame independently flex differently, right? Um, and a note on that, like when it comes to like chassis, right? If you're going to throw um, some really heavy springs on your vehicle, recognize that you are going to force your body in situations where you're flexing the body, right? You have a twisting kind of motion type thing, which is very common in off-roading. You are going to force your chassis to twist more, right? And it will. Your chassis will flex. On top of your chassis flexing, though, is your body will be forced to flex. And this is why FJ Cruisers, I haven't heard this being a problem on 4Runners, but I remember there was a time there where people were losing their mind because there were the inner body frame cracks, I guess is what they're, inner fender well cracks that were occurring on FJ Cruisers. And it was like ripping and tearing. And there was a lot of angry people about that whole deal. But the reality of it is it's because that chassis was twisting more than the body. And it was happening on a lot of people's vehicles. And I guess this was actually a lead over. It was also happening to Toyota Prados in Australia. But I think it was more on the side of if you were modding your vehicle. And I think the higher primary place where I saw it is with people were putting on a heavier weight spring. The spring does less compression, and in a twisting kind of setting, it caused the chassis to twist more, right? Now, where that comes into your bumpers is your bumpers, if you get them too close, there's a gap between your bumper and your body. And the reason why that is so those can flex independently, right. And so they can move independently, and you don't have nasty impacts where you have a lot of damage. Now, if you are going to off-road, expect some sort of damage, by the way.
Yeah.
I have to put that out there. I have to be very clear on that, everyone. If you're going to go off-roading, no matter what you're planning on doing, unless you're just going to drive on the most pleasant back road, dirt roads, and that's all you're going to do, if you're going to off-road, your vehicle will take damage. The damage to it may just be accelerated, right? Whereas like wear components are going to wear much faster, or you're just going to get stuff that hits and cracks and damages. And if you're modifying your vehicle for off-road use or for overlanding or whatever you're doing, to a degree, depending on if you're doing very mild modifications, you can expect it to be pretty consistent and stay close to stock, right? But if you're going outside of what was normally that vehicle's design premise, and you're going a ways outside of that, like a Jeep is very utilitarian driven, right? Your 4Runner is also more driven for your soccer moms and people like that, okay? That's just the reality of it, okay? The Jeep is very raw, right? The new Bronco, pretty raw, dude. They really made that specific to off-road. Your 3/4 ton and 1 ton trucks, same thing, right? But then when you're talking about, like I said, like the 4Runner is a good example. There's a lot of plastic on that, and a lot of things like that.
Yeah.
It really.
But just for the record, my 4Runner was very off-road.
Oh, it was very off-road capable. Yeah. I'm not saying anything about that. Capability's there,
I took it on
right?
many trails.
I think it was very capable.
The Alpine Loop.
The Lexus,
almost stock by the time.
Yeah, Lexus GX that we have is very capable. The Sequoias are very capable. All these vehicles are. I'm just
soccer moms can be cool too.
They can, well, of course they can. I got nothing against soccer moms. I know
the point is, there's a certain reality that comes along with off-roading.
Yes,
and
that certain reality to off-roading is that damage is a thing.
Right, and hopefully we're
if
mitigating
you're going to mod
that.
your vehicle,
yeah,
just kind of expect it.
Yeah, expect it.
Yeah,
you're mitigating that a lot when you're adding aftermarket bumpers, sliders, things like that, because it's offering a level of protection, obviously, that your plastic stock bumper won't do. Is it fail-proof against all damage? No,
it's not.
And there's a lot of factors that come into that. Driving skill, trail conditions, et cetera, et cetera.
How you drive. Like if you drive like you stole it.
Yeah. Are you
That's
like rock crawl racing? Yeah.
yeah, if you're driving
That's a little
fast and
different.
hard and stuff like that,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
You
And
gotta be nice to your cars, your
yeah, you try
vehicles.
to.
They
Yeah.
you should.
You
You
should.
want to get home,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So
Hopefully,
that's
yeah,
kind of part of the thing
that's part of the thing.
is yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So thank you, because that's that's something that comes up every now and then, as you know, when it comes to fit and finish. Obviously, we're using CNC equipment, so we really have very precise parts,
yes,
but that doesn't always uh, mitigate the
the
variations that can
variation
be
in
OEM
vehicles.
or whatever.
Yeah, and I
There's
mean
still variation.
even the OEM sometimes will just change stuff,
True.
right? Sometimes they're
We
just
found that mid-year
yeah,
even
mid-year they'll just
sometimes.
do a change and
Yeah.
you just all of a sudden
You
you're
find out.
surprised. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you're like, "Oh, okay."
Oh, you
So,
changed that.
yeah,
Okay.
it does happen. And so, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit though about the equipment that we use in the production
Okay.
of our parts. Um, CNC meaning
Computer numerically controlled.
which is a fancy term for
It is a very
yeah.
fancy term. Yeah. Just about everything you're going to buy these days is computer numerically controlled or has been made with those kind of machines. It's just kind of a necessity. It's very unlikely that you're going to buy something from somebody that hasn't run through some sort of CNC plasma table or something like that. It's becoming very very common and easy to get, right? Now, when you're talking about different equipment does matter, right? So we use a laser is going to give you a higher precision than a plasma, than a torch, etc. Right? So we use lasers to cut everything. Our presses and things like that are all very high precision. Our benders are extremely high precision. Their accuracy is within, as far as degrees, it's within, usually we're well within a half a degree, which is pretty darn precise, or even closer to that. Um, so the more precise equipment you can have, the better quality product you can have. There's this thing called tolerance stacking. I won't get into it too heavy, but it's like the more variation you can potentially have and the more tolerances as they stack up, right? Because your variation can be greater, the further out you can be, right? So the tighter the precision of your tools, the more accuracy you're going to have. So we also, with our fixturing and stuff, we also do a lot of work to make sure we have fixturing. I talked a little bit, I think, about welding, but when we weld our stuff, it is very important that it is fixtured and it's controlled, its shape is controlled, so it form fits and it looks clean and it fits upright, you know. And welding adds a lot of heat to something. There is an art to doing it right. There's an art to proper welding and doing things the right way. And because when you add that heat, there's shrinkage that occurs. There's all sorts of things that happen.
Right.
So,
and pretty doesn't always necessarily mean structurally
not when we're talking about welds.
sound.
No.
So
no. There's this misnomer out there, and a lot of people. I see this in a lot of different forums and groups and stuff like that, where somebody will be pointing out a weld, and now, granted, there are ugly welds.
Sure, which
that is a thing. It's totally a
try to
thing.
avoid that.
But there are people out there that their expectation is that a weld that's strong is a dime stack, right? Or looks like a dime stack, right? It's a perfectly clean sequence and it looks like a dime stack. And because it has the dime stack, it's strong. That's not true. It's not accurate. That's completely wrong. I can create a dime stack that has no bonding agent whatsoever, that is not doing its job, and it's going to fail no problem. So dime stack does not equal strength, right?
Right.
Usually that has more to do with the methods you're using. We pretty much use pulse MIG welding on just about everything. We do TIG welding as well on certain items, but for the most part, everything's pulse MIG,
Right.
rather than just standard DC current or DC MIG, just basic MIG. Um, it's not that basic MIG isn't strong or that you can't make it strong. It's a fine way to weld. However, pulse MIG, what that generates for you is you can actually see when you're doing the actually welding process and you're doing it right, you can actually see the metal liquefy visually rather than the wire going into a puddle and it's just building up and you're hoping you're getting good penetration on both sides, right? Really, it's quite amazing to look if you use pulse welders and stuff like that. You just know you're getting a good bond every time. And so pretty much every welder we have now, just about, is a pulse welder. And everything for the primary assembly of the bumpers and brackets and equipment, stuff like that, is pretty much all done on a pulse feed.
Is there a way that people can tell about if
No.
the weld is? I was gonna say, you can't really. You said you could look at a dime stack and be like, that looks beautiful. But
If you're a trained welder, you can, right? So one way you can tell is is if you look at it, you look at the edges of where the weld is. It's easier to tell when the bumper's bare. It's harder to tell when it's got coated, right? It's much more difficult, right? Because you got that extra layer on there. But you can kind of see sometimes if the edge of the weld are cold, you don't see a discoloration on the edges in the metal behind it, things like that. So a welder can tell.
Yeah.
But it's really difficult for once you've got paint on that thing, it's
hard to say.
It's hard to say. So generally, just like the ones, a lot of people will complain about the welds on their chassis and stuff like that on the frame of the vehicle not looking good, right? And it's always fun for me to use that as a point of how do you feel about the welds on your frame? And a lot of people are like, oh, they suck. And it's like, no, they don't. They're done on a robot that's using pulse, and unless they're missing, like what happened with Jeep when they introduced the JL and there's people with missing welds. Yikes. Yeah. Or welds that weren't quite bonded. Robot must have been off that day or something like that. Besides that, if you don't have that, I mean, as long as the weld's laying down, you're getting good solid penetration and it's going to be a strong product. So yeah, that's a tricky one for people to just identify, right?
Right.
Quality, I mean, when it really comes down to quality is just driven by who you're buying something from, right? And some people are just, they're looking to bring it all back around. They're just looking for a product, right? That's going to fill their needs, right? And they look at it and they're like, oh, that looks good. A lot of times the marketing sells the product, right? And there's companies out there, I'm not going to name names, but there's companies out there that have incredible marketing and they're really good at really generating that feeling in people to go like, oh, that's what I want. That's the look, that's the feel, and that's the function, right? They're really good at it. But I can tell you that when I look at some of these vehicles, comparing it to what we do and the energy and the extra work that we put into our product for the cost, in a lot of senses, you're really just paying for a brand name, right? That's what you're paying for. You're not necessarily paying for a higher level of function in a lot of respects. You're just paying for a brand name, and that's what you're getting.
Right.
You're getting the name. You're not necessarily getting all the quality that you think you're getting. But that's a hard thing for people to know
it's hard.
What's what,
which is, why we try to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Recovery points, clevis mounts, or shackle mounts. They're welded inside and out.
That's how we do it.
That's how we do it. That's something people can look for.
Yeah, surface mounted stuff is no bueno.
Yeah, bolt in.
You can't weld
recovery
something.
Points are probably not a good like maybe not the best.
Depends on how they are. Like, so some of our bumpers actually are bolted in.
That's true.
But they're bolted in double shear with 3 bolts that are 5/8 of an inch. So they're just not going to fail, right? So, and then there's also an internal structure in which they're bolting into and mounting into. So it just depends on what people are doing. Surface mount welded products that aren't welded all the way through, those are one that it's like steer clear in my opinion, but because I've seen those rip off, right? In general though, I mean, and we did talk about this a little bit in winching, the angle of the winching, right? 20-degree angle winch, right? If is coming out of the front of the fairlead 20 degrees, going this way or down or up, is really the recommended maximum that you should be anchoring from. Now, unfortunately, when you're out in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm and it's muddy and you're tired and your only ride home is buried and you need to get it out and your only anchor point is at a 90-degree angle, sometimes you're doing it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
It's just
It's just
you're
the
going to give that a
ideal
shot because
scenario.
it's like, oh, we got to try and get this out of here. So
Right.
sometimes that works, but you risk breakage. You, in a lot of sense, you not only on your vehicle, but you risk breakage on the ropes, particularly and damaging your fair lead opening. A lot of people, like, you look at a fair lead where it's coming out, a lot of the older bumpers just have like, here's a flange and it goes up and the fair lead's right there. And that's all there's to it, right? You pull at a side pull heavy on that at 9,000 pounds, it's just going to tweak it back into it. So that's not what it was really designed for. But unfortunately, when you're just trying to save yourself or,
Right. Right.
you do what you have to do. So,
Okay. One last part of quality, which is that finish step, is the powder coat finish, which is not a process we do in-house right now. We subcontract it. We have multiple vendors that provide that service. But I just want to talk for a minute about powder coat and what it is and what it's not.
What it's not.
And what realistically to expect and kind of the process our stuff goes through with our vendors.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with our powder coat, we've kind of held our vendors to a very specific standard. And it's not really, I mean, that's the thing. We say our powder coat, but what it really boils down to is we're mostly just supplying a service right now.
Right.
And the service, though, we had a very specific, like, this is what we require for this service of what we're going to offer.
So on that note, I guess before we go too far down that road,
right,
we do ship out bare metal, and we love it when customers want bare metal, because it just speeds up the process.
There's definitely benefits to it.
Yeah. If you have an option to coat locally, it's a little bit easier to follow up with any warranty scenarios on your powder coat finish. If you want a custom color of any sort, or you're trying to color match to your vehicle,
that's tricky.
Local is definitely the way to go with that. In fact, we don't offer colored powder coat really because of that reason. Too hard to do over long distances. But yeah, and then of course the possibility of getting any damage to your powder coat shipping and freight is non-existent.
Yep.
So that's always a bonus too. So increased speed time, not quite as worried about, showing up without any scrapes or anything on your coat finish, and then just a little bit easier follow up with any customization or warranty when you order bare metal.
Yeah, for the most part, I mean, you can go into a powder coater, in your area if you know good ones or something like that, and you can say, how long will you warranty this for?
Right.
And by the fact that you're there and you live there, a lot of them are going to be able to say, oh yeah, I'll warranty it a year, I'll warranty it longer, and so and because they're all happy to recoat your stuff, they're all perfectly fine with it.
Most of them.
Yeah, for the most part.
Them,
the ones that are going to stand behind their product,
right,
for the most part, they're all fine with recoating the product. What they're not okay with necessarily is giving you free money, right?
Right.
They don't want to give you money, but they're happy to recoat it.
Right.
Usually is what I've found. So that's why you can generally do that, and that's why this scenario works.
Right.
But as far as for us, our stuff, and I mean, that's the whole thing, is our warranty with that stuff is only as good as what our vendors are willing to offer us. And it's not a profit point. It's not a point where we're making money. It's a point where we're just supplying this service, but we want it to be as high quality as we can get it, right? So when it comes to powder coat, right? Powder coat is basically like a little plastic shell, right? What you have is these little plastic molecules. And I say plastic, I'm using this generally. They're like polyesters and stuff like that. There's tons of different types, right? Vinyl ones and whatever. But you have these little tiny molecules of plastic, right, of powder, and they're electrostatically charged. And the idea is that they actually create an electrostatic bond to the bumper and to each other and to themselves, and they're all kind of stuck on there. You put that in an oven, it heats up the plastic. The plastic goes from these little balls to actually just kind of like going like this, interlinking itself to
Mm-hmm.
one another, and then you have a nice candy coating. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole idea behind how powder coat works. The challenges with powder coat are like in tight areas and stuff like that, places where paint, like if you're painting something, paint will run, right? It'll run and blend into those places. Powder doesn't like doing that. Powder oftentimes, because when it's sprayed, you'll have these molecules coming into these tight areas and they'll push each other out.
Right.
They're electrostatically charged, and so they're pushing each other away, and you'll have areas where you're not getting a good bond inside there. And that's one of the challenges with powder coating. I mean, the reason why it's so prominently used is that it's actually a very efficient, low cost industrial coating.
Mm-hmm.
That's why so many industries use powder coating, and it's a good coat, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the end all be
Yeah,
all.
it's not a bed liner.
It's
It's
not a
not
bed
Line
liner.
X.
Absolutely not.
We've had a lot of customers do a Line X finish on bumpers, which is awesome
Yeah,
because it's way less maintenance.
it is. It's very
Um,
rugged.
mm-hmm.
I
Will
mean,
take a beating.
it
Yeah.
will. It's a whole like another layer of strength is the truth of
Mm-hmm.
it. It's pretty amazing.
But the powder coat most are going to be your basic level of coverage and protection. A good one,
Yeah,
and
it's a
an
good one.
industrial one, but you still have to do upkeep. So
You
you
do.
live anywhere with salts on the roads or mag chloride, especially, or you drive out on a beach or you're in a salty
Yeah, ocean.
ocean.
Yeah,
You can't do that.
that is not a good idea. Or if you have a giant salt deposit and you're like, I'm gonna go
It
drive
does
on the
some
salt
salt
flat. You
flats.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
Then
yeah,
you better be spending 30 or $40 to just wash the
wash that thing
crap
up.
out of everything.
Yeah,
So
wash it up good.
you got to wash frequently. You can touch up little
If
spots,
you
those
want the
pinhole
longevity
spots.
out of it, you know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
pinhole spots, like, so that's a good point right there, right? If
mm-hmm.
you get a pinhole from like a rock, because
Or a chip.
you can
Yeah.
still get a rock chip,
Yeah.
right? It's not
Yeah.
like it's impossible. Or, I don't know, maybe you get a bug that has some weird acid that burns through it. I don't know. That could be a thing, right? But yeah, no, you get a little chip right that's where you have your problem where rust will start to form.
Mm-hmm.
It's in those spots. It just seeps underneath and it moves across the face of the bumper. Like our processes, we do a multi-stage process wash, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our vendors are doing a multi-stage process wash and etch and sealer, and then they're doing on top of that, we're having them do a zinc rich primer,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're having them do the top coat,
Right.
right? So we're doing our best to provide the best coat that we possibly can. Um, and
Yeah.
it's a good coat,
Yeah.
right? But maintenance, I mean,
Right.
you can still have oxidization that will occur. You can get
Yeah.
a rock chip, you can get a scratch from off-roading, you can have potential areas where it's such a micro hole that you don't see it. Or let's say you're in a polar vortex or something like that, and your Jeep is covered with magnesium chloride all over it because they've been salting
Mm-hmm.
the roads because they're super icy, and you park your car outside and you don't wash it for a winter. That shrinkage that's occurring between the materials that can allow for this salt to get in behind there will cause oxidization, and then it can just eat away your whole bumper. So,
Right.
yeah, if you see like and this is the same thing with your chassis, right?
Yeah. Your
Same
frame.
thing with your
Your
frame,
frame is
man.
subject to the same. Yeah.
You'll see this on your frame. You'll get these little areas. I mean, I used to like every spring I would just go get some paint from the hardware store and paint my frame
Mm-hmm.
just to keep rust
Just a
down.
layer
Yeah,
of protection.
just a layer of
So
protection.
if
Like
you do have
anywhere I saw rust, I just
chips
covered
and
it.
whatnot, you can just paint it and keep it clean.
Yeah,
Paint it.
that's the way to do it.
Just
Just
kind of
touch it up.
try to keep it, maintain it as long as you can.
Yeah,
And then
and
at
that
the
will
end of
help
the
maintain
day,
your
you
coat.
can always do a sandblast and a recoat
Yeah,
if if it comes to that, depending on your conditions and
yeah.
where you are.
If a decade down the road, it's like that's where you're at or whatever.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
and it does happen. The more and then that's the other thing too is it's just not salt on roads and stuff like that. If you're going off and you're playing in the mud a lot, the minerals inside that mud
Mm.
and everything like that that you're coating on your car, you have no idea
Mhm.
what might be in those minerals, right?
Mhm.
And you can have a lot of stuff in there that can actually lead to oxidization too. So if you want your product to last, best thing to do is just take good care of it. If you have a garage, park in the garage. It helps. It's actually pretty crazy. It actually does a lot. Sun will fade, sun will do damage, a lot of things. So, and that's coat.
That's coat. And those are
So,
some of the points of quality that you can look for,
yeah.
when you're doing your shopping and looking for aftermarket product.
Finding out what's best, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anything else? Is that mostly everything?
That's mostly everything. I don't know where you want to squeeze
This guy?
that into. It's not kind of more of a design or
New product.
new product.
We should just have like a new product thing. We talk about new
Yeah, I'm like
products.
that wasn't one of your things, so that
Yeah.
probably should be a different one.
Yep. No, it was a good chat. Um, yeah. Should we close it?
Yep.
Thanks for watching, everybody. If you lasted that long through that whole chat,
That was a longer
that
chat.
is that is
A lot to talk
products and
about.
quality. Yeah, it's kind of weird because it just veers. Like we have like this is the direction we're going, but we end up going all over the place. But I think it's good coverage. So, and if you're watching this or something and you have any suggestions, you can email us info@expedition1.biz. And you can say, hey, I'd like it if you guys talked a little bit more about this
Yeah.
subject, right?
Yeah.
There's quite a few subjects that I may not know that may be of interest to people, but I may know something about, or we might be able to get a guest on that we can talk more about it. So yeah, if you got suggestions, please let us know. And so that was episode 8, right?
Right.
Right. Well, thanks for listening and watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time.